Сьогодні я буду говорити англійською, але спочатку я хотів
I will be speaking English today, but first I wanted to say hello in Ukrainian.
the new human rights challenges in Crimea since Russia's full-scale aggression against Ukraine. Human Rights House Foundation unites a network of human rights houses, local coalitions of civil society organizations across Eastern Europe, the Western Balkans, and the Caucasus. It is my distinct honor and privilege to share the stage this morning with four inspirational figures from Ukrainian civil society and representatives of organizations which work together under the banner of the Human Rights House Crimea. As a bit of housekeeping, this morning's sessions will be divided between short presentations by our panelists, after which we will welcome questions and statements from the audience. We had hoped to welcome a colleague from Human Rights House Zagreb, but she fell quite ill yesterday and will be unable to join us, and I will make the concluding remarks in her absence. I would also note that our photographer will be taking photographs this morning during the session. If you do not wish to have your image captured, please do let him know. And while this is the first session of the day, we will set the right tone for the rest of the day and conclude promptly by 10:10. So if I can welcome our panelists onto the stage, you're welcome. In 2016, two of our panelists, along with several others, published The Peninsula of Fear, the title taken from a statement from Ukraine's ombudsperson at the time, and which sought to highlight the human rights situation stemming from Russia's illegal invasion and annexation of Crimea. That report highlighted torture, kidnapping, and other persecutions of journalists, human rights defenders, and Crimean Tatar and Ukrainian activists, and other severe restrictions on civil and political rights, among other human rights. 2 years later, in 2019, the network of human rights houses organized a mission to Crimea in order to break the wall of silence erected in the time since Russia's invasion. At that time, we concluded that civic space where independent voices may be heard had ceased to exist in Crimea and raised alarms about systemic repression of freedoms of assembly, association, and expression. We further concluded that discrimination and persecution on religious and ethnic grounds was taking place against Crimean Tatars. In between these and in the time since, Ukrainian human rights organizations, the UN monitoring mission in Ukraine, international human rights organizations, and any number of government and other stakeholders have reported on what can only be described as a crisis in Crimea. Systematic repression against Crimean Tatars, severe clampdowns on any form of dissent, attacks on journalists and human rights defenders, arbitrary detention, abductions, torture. The list goes on and on. Less than a month ago, in its latest report, the Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights raised concerns that the legitimate activities of human rights defenders in Crimea are being obstructed by arrests, prosecution, and the blocking of access to websites of human rights NGOs. They further documented cases of 89 individuals in Crimea facing prosecution for, quote, discrediting the armed forces of the Russian Federation. This morning, our panelists will delve deeper into several key aspects of this deepening human rights crisis in Crimea and offer recommendations on what representatives to the Crimea Platform Parliamentary Summit and other stakeholders can do in response. I would first like to introduce Tatiana Pachonchik. Tatiana is the head of the Human Rights Center Zmina, and along with 26 other NGOs, Zmina launched Ukraine's 5 a.m. coalition in February to document war crimes, support victims, and bring perpetrators to justice. Zmina is the recipient of 2022 Democracy Defender Award from OSCE participating states. Tatiana, how acute is the overall human rights situation today, and what trends have you documented since February? Floor is yours.
Дуже дякую, Дейве. Дорогі колеги,
Thank you very much, Dave, dear colleagues. Good morning. I am really glad to see so many people from Ukraine today in today's media. Human society, civil society organizations. And today we are happy to start this first day of the work of the First Parliamentary Summit. And I think it is very important that we start but this session because the civil society has always had a strong voice in the occupation of Crimea, in documenting the human rights violations and the crimes that took place all these years in Crimea. Now it's 8 months exactly since the start of the full-fledged military invasion of the Russia against Ukraine. Raping, torture, murders, all of this continued for 8 months. Destruction of educational and cultural and religious sites, thousands of them. And for us as human rights defenders, this war started long ago, 8 years, 8 months and 4 days ago, when Russia started the invasion by the attempt to occupy the Crimea, the Crimean peninsula. And for these 8 months, Crimea has been somewhat in the background because even more terrible things are happening in the newly occupied territories of Ukraine. But it doesn't mean that the situation in Crimea is stable. It is drastically worse now. It has happened in these 8 months since the beginning of the invasion. As human rights defenders, we note that for the first time in the recent years, they have returned to the practice of kidnapping of citizens, something that we have not seen for a few years. And sometimes they keep people incommunicado without access to lawyers or to their relatives. They move some people there into Crimea from the occupied Kherson Oblast, and we have the information that this practice of violent disappearing was applied to several people, such as Ivan Kozlov, Sergei Tsigipa, Maria Garcia Kalatayub, Ruslan Abdurrahmanov, Apasav Kurtamed. However, no one can say for sure how many people are now victims of such kidnapping and are kept illegally in prisons in the occupied Crimea. Besides, there is now a stronger trend for pressure and prosecution of independent lawyers and journalists in the occupied Crimean peninsula. In particular, in May this year, 4 lawyers from among Crimean Tatars were detained and later arrested and penalized. Adem Simidlaev, Nazim Shekhmambetov, Aider Zambatov, and Emine Emambileva. Besides, 3 more lawyers were deprived of the bar, so they cannot continue their law activities. Those are people who have been protecting our people, Rustem Kamilev, Nazim Shekhmambetov, and so on. This has led to the fact that it is now increasingly harder to find new lawyers that can help our citizens in Crimea.
In addition to that, there is a continuous persecution of journalists. As of today, at least 14 persons, professional journalists, are the political prisoners, and they're imprisoned currently. And 2 of them were imprisoned after the 24th of February 2022. It's Irina Danilovich and Leon Demiryanov, who cooperated with the Crimean Solidarity initiatives. As of now, more than 150 Ukrainian citizens are political prisoners that are captured either in territory of Crimea or they were moved to facilities in the Russian Federation, and dozens of them were imprisoned after the 3rd wave of Russian aggression against Ukraine. And as the human rights activists for many years, we've been using all possible legal mechanisms in order to protect the human rights in the occupied Crimea. But for us, it's quite obvious that only the occupation of Crimean Peninsula will allow to bring rule of law to that place. And that's why this forum, the Crimean Platform that unites more than 15 countries, is the most powerful instrument to liberate our prisoners and restore human rights in the Crimean Peninsula. Thank you very much.
Jenna, thank you. Our next speaker this morning is Valentina Potapova. Valentina is the head of the Center for Civic Education Almenda. Almenda was founded in Yalta in 2008 and has worked in exile since 2014. Almenda has worked for many years documenting and reporting on human rights violations in Crimea, particularly around economic, social, and cultural rights. With the invasion of Ukraine by Russia, Almenda now works with other human rights and humanitarian organizations to document war crimes, particularly those committed against children. Valentina, how is the Crimean educational system being used by Russian forces, and what evidence has Almenda and your partners documented? The floor is yours.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Dave. And I would like to say that as Tatiana has reminded us today is 8 years, 8 months, and 4 days of Russian-Ukrainian war that started from Crimea. And if we will try to find the association, so the first thing that comes to my mind is lie. And the second thing that comes to my mind is the medieval times. Because in this, it's not possible in a civilized world that is built on the rule of law, respect for human rights, to so brutally violate human rights and neglect international law. And when the Russian invaders back in 2014 captured and occupied Crimean peninsula, they were tasked with a large problem. What do they do with children who were born in Ukraine and didn't know any other motherland other than Ukraine? This youth could have become a very strong threat to Putin's regime because they knew what freedom is about. And then they decided to commit a crime. To erase the identity of these children by prohibiting language and culture through propaganda, through militarization. 8 years, occupants liberating the instruments through informal or formal education to replace the identity of children. Namely, more than 500,000 children at that time were in Crimea in 2014, and they become a target of Russian occupants. So, and while the entire world tried to make to pretend that the violation of human rights of the children and international documents that protect the children's rights during the military conflicts is not sufficient to impose sanctions, Russia built a Crimean model of cultural genocide in the occupied territories. So in formal education, it meant the destroyed access to language, and they run the weekly conversation about important things, replacement of textbooks and prohibition of Ukrainian-centered subjects and perversion of Ukrainian history and history of Ukrainian Crimean Tatars. Open the military lessons, so-called cadet classes at schools, replacement of teachers that were in Crimea with Russian teachers in accordance with Zemsky teacher programming. So this is the militarization through children's organization, Youth Army, big recess, and military patriotic camps, and holding military patriotic games, Zaranitsa and Zaranichka, for children of 7 to 9 years old. So militarization program that was imposed by Russian Federation. They're aimed at intimidating with external threats, systematical forming the image of enemy when they speak about Ukraine, and later they form the image of enemy on the basis of collective West and Europe. It has to be opposed with the arms and propagate the cult of war and violence. And they teach how to treat arms, and they instill love in the law enforcement agencies of Russian Federation, and they create the motivation. They motivate them to serve in the armed forces of Russian Federation. Right now, in the occupied Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, the Russian government tries to implement this Crimean scenario by imposing the Russian identity in libraries and schools. They remove Ukrainian books and textbooks. Instead of them, they bring the Russian books with the politically correct interpretation of history. And administrations and teachers of education institutions are forced to use Russian standards using different methods, including intimidation. And there are some instances when the teachers were abducted. Those who didn't agree to cooperate with the occupational forces. The Crimean scenario of influencing the children's conscience is enforced by the fact that their parents are deprived the right of distant Ukrainian education. They are deprived of the homeschooling, and there is the fact that the occupational power in Zaporizhia region, they intimidate parents to deprive them the parental rights if their children do not attend local schools. So the children in near-front territories right now, those children are sent to Crimea and Russia. They sent around 2,000 children, and they plan to send 4,000 children to be sent. We understand that these children, they will be the hostages in order to make their parents loyal to the Russian power, because they're taken from their parents. The scenario 2014 has been elaborated, and I can say this is the medieval scenario because there is no other idea that comes to my mind. So raising Ukrainian identity, and at any time, and I emphasize that at any time, it can be implemented in any country, in any military conflict. I have a very rhetorical question. Do we need to stop this? Can we together stop this? Thank you.
Valentina, thank you for that, which is, of course, really quite shocking information to hear and to think about. Our next speaker this morning is Katerina Rashevska. Katerina is a lawyer with the Regional Center for Human Rights. It's an organization of lawyers, human rights defenders, and activists focused on documenting human rights violations committed by Russian authorities in occupied Crimea, and then taking those cases to relevant national and international bodies. Katya, the Regional Center for Human Rights has also been documenting cases of enforced deportation from Crimea, as well as what seems to be attempts to destroy Crimean cultural identity. What have you found in this regard?
Ukraine is on fire. The country is being decimated before the eyes of the world. The impact on civilians is reaching terrifying proportions. Almost 2 million Ukrainian citizens have been forcibly deported to the territory of the Russian Federation. Among them, at least 300,000 Ukrainian children. And this crime is ongoing. The Russian Federation uses demography in order to strengthen its hand against the Ukrainian nation. Demographic engineering is becoming a defining feature of the Russian aggression. Through destruction, rapes, tortures, siege, starvation, Russian soldiers deported Ukrainian men, women, and children. And this strategy of the Russian Federation is not new. It was well tested during the attempted annexation of the Crimean Peninsula. These 8 years, the Russian Federation has been carrying out the policy of forcible change of the demographic composition through deportation and displacement of disloyal Ukrainian populations and colonization of this territory from Russian citizens. The so-called soft demographic engineering also occurs when Russia is trying to eradicate Ukrainian and Crimean Tatars' culture and identity. Through all this large-scale excavation with destruction and damages for our cultural seats, with abduction of our cultural heritage, with all this persecution of human rights defenders, activists, and other representatives of active population, of disloyal population, the Russian Federation carried out demographic engineering in Crimea. According to our calculation, at least 800,000 Russian colonizers moved to the Crimean Peninsula during these 8 years. And even after the large-scale invasion, Russians arrived to the Crimean Peninsula and continued to arrive. It's not only Russian soldiers, but also law enforcement officials and judges. Thus, among 305 judges of courts of general jurisdiction, at least 19 are representatives of the Russian Federation from 32 subjects of Russia. 11 judges moved to the peninsula during February-September 2022. Russia also deported disloyal Ukrainian population from the peninsula and stimulated the flow of disloyal Ukrainians, the flow of internally displaced persons. The number is between 60 and 110,000 people. Russia also deported the representatives of the so-called vulnerable groups. Among them, at least 12,000 Ukrainian prisoners and 70 Ukrainian orphans forcibly deported from the territory of occupied Crimea to the Russian Federation and then illegally adopted by Russian families. And now, the number of Ukrainian children illegally adopted by Russian families reaches 309 persons. And this number will be much higher because the Russian Federation implemented all necessary changes to its legislation. And the level of impunity is so high that even Russian children ombudsman Maria Lvova-Belova boasts that she adopted by herself boy from Mariupol. We should repress the repetition of the Crimean scenario in newly occupied territories, because from Chechnya to Georgia to Syria to Crimea, the Russian believes that they would get away with it. And unfortunately, the occupation of the Crimean Peninsula demonstrated that they were right. Stand up for Ukraine. Should take concrete steps in order to ensure the earliest possible deoccupation and reintegration of the Crimean Peninsula into Ukraine. We should ensure the investigation of all international crimes by the ICC and also implement the principle of universal jurisdiction whenever it is possible. We should also ensure the repurposing of frozen Russian assets to victims' need, because no justice, no peace. We need peace for Ukraine and not the policy of appeasement. We need peace now. This strategy must stop. Thank you.
Katerina, thank you. We are now going to turn to a speaker online, I hope. Our next speaker, here he is Iskender Bariev. Iskender is the head of the Department of Legal Affairs and Foreign Affairs of the Mejli of the Crimean Tatar people. He also serves as the head of the board of the Crimean Tatar Resource Center. Iskender, this morning our colleagues have raised evidence of increased targeting of Crimean and Crimean Tatar activists, efforts to destroy Crimean Tatar cultural identity. How would you respond to this? How would you describe the situation for Crimean Tatars today? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, dear Dave. I will speak Ukrainian. Шановні повноважні представники.
Dear participants of the free nations of the world, dear ladies and gentlemen, I would like to sincerely thank all the nations and the countries that have supported the Crimean platform and united around it, because it's not just a club of interest, that's a big responsibility before the whole humanity. For these 8 months of full-fledged aggression, we've seen daily bombardments of Ukrainian cities and murders of Ukrainians. And there are already 8 years of occupation of Crimea, where they systemically prosecute Ukrainian citizens and violate the rights of the Crimean Tatars. It's more than 260,000 political prisoners. 189 of them are people from Crimean Tatars. 112 are representatives of indigenous people. They are in prison, and they include Nariman Jalal. The forbidden is the Majlis of Crimean Tatars, all the independent media of Crimean Tatars. Russians violate all the rights, including the rights to speech or the rights to receive the education in the native language. And on the newly occupied territories in Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts, for the period of this full-fledged invasion, we have documented at least 289 cases of detentions. That is kidnapping, basically. 84 against the indigenous Crimean Tatar people. 18 arrests, 15 against Crimean Tatars. And in fact, we are speaking about those cases where we have the decisions of the occupation courts. A lot of our people are now being tortured in Genichisk Rayon, in Kherson Oblast, in Kherson City, and other places. I would like to focus my speech on the example of the mobilization. On the 21st of September, so-called partial mobilization started, which was organized with the violation of the international humanitarian law. Since the 21st of September, they started mobilizing forcibly a lot of Crimean Tatars. There are cases when they were forcibly taken to the military commissariat of the Russian forces. Analyzing the data of the mobilized residents of Crimea, we see that in the lists of the mobilized people, Crimean Tatars are a much larger proportion than their proportion of the general population of Crimea. Sometimes it's 80 to 90% of mobilized. The Crimean Tatars are trying to avoid the participation in the war crimes of Russia, leaving massively to Georgia, Kazakhstan, and other countries. For example, in Kazakhstan alone, there are now more than 2,000 Crimean Tatars. However, to stay longer, they don't have the accommodation and they lack money. Since the beginning of the mobilization, since the 21st of September until the 13th of October, about 100 mobilized Crimean Tatars have perished. Most of them never signed any contracts with the Russian army and were in the war zone not because of their own volition. And the forcible mobilization of the residents of the occupied Crimea to the military forces of the Russian Federation is a violation of the 51st article of Geneva Convention. So we recommend to the UN and the Red Cross and Red Crescent organizations to speak up against the illegal forcible mobilization of Crimean Tatars and other residents of occupied territories. support creating humanitarian corridors to evacuate the men from the occupied territories, including Crimea, to the third countries, include UN members. Provide a plan for humanitarian support of those thousands of Crimean Tatars who have moved to Georgia, Kazakhstan, and other countries. Increase the pressure onto Russia and use all the available mechanisms to stop the illegal mobilization of Crimean Tatars to the forces of the Russian Federation, which is basically like a death sentence against the indigenous population and a part of the state terrorism of Russia. And we are fighting not just for our rights and freedoms, we are on the front line of the fight between the democracy and the authoritarianism. Thank you.
I'm so glad that you were able to join us this morning through the magic of technology. Finally, this morning, our last speaker, I'd like to welcome someone who's very well known to the Crimea Platform, Olga Skripnik. Olga is the head of the Crimean Human Rights Group. Crimean Human Rights Group has been a critical voice in documenting and reporting on human rights violations in Crimea since Russia invaded and occupied in 2014. In particular, the organization and others have reported on the arbitrary arrest and detention of Crimean political figures, human rights defenders, journalists, lawyers, and others. Olga, what are the trends and evidence concerning freedom of opinion and expression in Crimea today?
Thank you, Dave. Dear colleagues, it's a pleasure to be here. And we are grateful to our international partners to supporting Ukraine and supporting Crimean Platform. All of us also represent the expert network of Crimea Platform. Crimea Platform exists on 3 dimensions: parliamentary, governmental, and expert. And our organizations are members of working group of human rights and international humanitarian law of expert network Crimea Platform. So I would like to focus on freedom of speech. Since the beginning of the Crimea occupation, a large-scale militarization of the peninsula, as well as the Crimea military base development for future aggression against Ukraine started. And during the 8 months after February 24th, more than 800 cruise missiles, different cruise missiles were launched from Crimea and the Black Sea, that caused deaths and injuries of the civilians, including children. However, a full-scale war of Russian Federation against Ukraine has been also prepared in the humanitarian dimension. Therefore, since 2014, the curtailment of freedom of speech and expression of opinion has begun. Russia destroyed all Ukrainian mass media than any mass media that it couldn't control. The Russian authorities have built a large scale system of political persecution, and my colleague Tetiana Pechonchik told about it. The next step was deprive Crimeans of access to information. Websites of Ukrainian news resources, of human rights and non-governmental organizations are blocked in Crimea, and Ukrainian radio frequencies are being blocking with Russia-controlled Crimea broadcasters broadcasting on them. Moreover, Russia began to block the radio signal in the Kherson region as early as 2020. In summer 2021, our monitors documented in Kherson region that the Russia Federation have seized at least 34 Ukrainian radio frequencies, and Russia radio station broadcasted on these frequencies. And today, most of the Kherson region is occupied by the Russian army. Journalists and activists are being killed and abducted there in the line with the pre-compliant FSB lists. So freedom of expression was immediately restricted, and with the number of restrictions increasing year to year. And after February 24th, a new wave of persecution for the anti-war position and support for Ukraine began. A new administrative article about discrediting the Russian army is being applied for persecution. The Crimean Human Rights Group documented at least 120 administrative cases under this article. The most common reason for persecution was no war statement published on social networks or single protest protest, or I am for peace statement. In order to initiate proceeding, it's enough to call the war a war, or to publish information that the Russian armed forces have been involved in mass killing of civilians in Ukraine. Performing the national anthem of Ukraine, or chanting the slogan "Glory to Ukraine," or Ukrainian songs also constitute the reason for persecuting in Crimea. All these years, the Russia-controlled media and officials have been using the hate speech. Ukrainians and Crimea Tatars, the Orthodox Church of Ukraine and Muslims were subject of informational and psychological attacks from media inciting consistently hatred. The next step was to prepare society to accept the idea that Ukraine does not exist as a state. Then the Russian authorities moved to calls for the genocide of Ukrainians. Today, Russian journalists and public opinions leaders are not just propagandists. They are complicit in the international crime of incitement to genocide. Therefore, we call on democratic countries and the Crimea Platform members to support the investigation of these crimes and bring these people to justice. We suggest that human rights and media organizations join the collection of information about Russian citizens who have created content of propagandistic nature and have called, as well as are calling, for the genocide of Ukrainians, and the Commission of International Crimes have spread and are spreading such content and are financing such activities. These propagandists are working not only in Russia, but also in European countries, in the USA. For years, they have been educated hatred for Ukrainian civilians, calling for our elimination. This is why the world now knows about the most terrible crimes against unarmed men, women, and children committed by the Russian army in Bucha, in Irpin, in Mariupol, and other many Ukrainian cities. The Russian propaganda that has transformed it into incitement to genocide is a serious challenge for the entire civilized world. This is a powerful weapon aimed at destroying the system of democratic values. Thank you very much.
Olga, thank you. I am conscious of the time, but I also am conscious that we did want to have a little bit of time for questions from the audience if you have some. Fantastic. We don't have to go to my prepared questions. Please, and if you can introduce yourself as well. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Oksana Pokolchuk. Which language shall we use?
I beg your pardon?
Which language?
Wish.
Okay. So my question is to the panelists. Do you see any difference in perception of information about atrocities committed by Russia in Crimea now in international media or in different audiences around Ukraine? Because we all know that before the full-scale invasion, the question of Crimea was really forgotten by international society in other countries around Ukraine. And is there any changes now in perception of this information in Western European countries, in North America, in South America, or in Africa?
Tanya, I know you just got back from West Africa. Maybe I'll start with you to answer that question.
Справді, я сюди прилетіла з Нігерії.
Indeed, I came from India, Nigeria, and Ghana. We, as the Ukrainian delegation, worked with the government of these countries. We work with media, with civil society organizations, with the business. And this is the region, as we call it, the global south, where there was a strong Russian influence present, and we in fact neglected that region as the Ukrainian government. And so the perception of this topic differs from region to region. I think if we talk about democratic West, EU countries, North America, United States, Canada, so maybe they started to realize that this third wave of Russian full-scale military aggression after the occupation of Crimea and starting war in Donbass in 2014 became the drag on it was the direct impact of the occupation of Crimea in 2014, and since the Russian army is not punished for these crimes, make them feel that they can do that in the future. And we see that with the new waves of aggression, the number of crimes increase. During the first years of occupation of Crimea, 44 abductions or enforced disappearances were recorded. And in Donbass, there were hundreds of disappearances, forced disappearances. We remember the notorious torture room and isolations when hundreds of people had disappeared. And now the scale of disappearance counts in hundreds and thousands. So with the new circle of aggression, we have more and more crimes, and we need a strong response from the West. And if we had this response in 2014, I think we didn't have this bloody war now. Speaking about other regions of the world, the situation is more difficult, and we need to pay a lot of efforts to explain the reasons and causes of this war. And because they perceive it as the war between Russia and NATO, and they think that NATO provoked the war by expansion of NATO. But we, as civil society, we need to pay more efforts to work with these countries. Thank you, Oksana, for your question. One point I'd like to highlight is that after 2014, significant number of countries perceived the occupation of Crimea as some sort of local conflict, but we warned them this is a threat to the security of the region and the whole world. Now it's not perceived as a local conflict. Everybody understands that the occupation of Crimea was the beginning of full-scale aggression and that we witness now, and now it's the threat to all countries, especially after the nuclear threat has emerged. And some information is perceived is more easy to understand by them. We see that this year, number of countries that joined Crimean platform has increased. It's a good sign. At the same time, we see other risks after what happened in China. We realized there are another significant threats to work with, and today we see there are more global threats, and it will be difficult to speak about Crimea, but it doesn't mean it's impossible to talk about this topic. But Crimea is the issue of global security and not a local conflict. Thank you. Я думаю, може, у нас є час. У нас є.
Other questions from the audience? Then I will ask just one maybe to Katya and Valentina. You've both talked about and spoke to information that you gathered from and have been gathering from inside of Crimea. Obviously, without asking you to divulge sensitive or security-related information, what are some of the challenges that you're facing now in terms of communicating with groups and individuals on the ground in Crimea, and what are ways that the international community can be supporting those efforts?
Якщо можна, я розпочну.
Let me start. I would like to add to the previous question. I'd like to explain with the specific case. We started to call the spade a spade, and we tried to see the real facts in the context of the children that were adopted in the Russian Federation since the full-scale aggression. We recollected this crime has started from the temporary occupation of Crimea in 2014. We found at least 70 orphans of Crimea that were deported to Russian Federation under their Train of Hope program, and they were turned into their enemies of their own nation. We started to use this fact together with the genocide. We're not afraid that somebody will look as of non-competence, and because we, during these 8 months, we learned by heart so that the acts of the Russian Federation is the crimes, not only crimes against the humanity, but it's a purposeful destruction of the Ukrainian nation. And we don't know what's going to happen tomorrow. Concerning the communication in the Crimean Peninsula, we deal with the vulnerable groups. I mentioned in my report the orphans that cannot support communication. I usually ask, how do you communicate with your victims? Just imagine an orphan who is 4 to 5 years, who is deported to Russian Federation. How can we communicate with that orphan? Is it possible? And the same is true about our prisoners that were deported to Russian Federation. They were placed in the special facilities, and they're deprived of everything. So how can we communicate with them? This is just we're lucky that they can find a telephone, somehow contact us because they trust us, and they can relate information. So they're very unified in these Russian colonies, and they can tell what's happening to them. The same is true for Ukrainian lawyers. They protected our Ukrainian political prisoners, and they fought for the freedom in that piece of territory where there was no freedom after these 80 years. They were so brave, they continued to communicate with us by all possible means, regardless of the threats, regardless of the persecutions. People in that territory, they in fact, so they sacrifice themselves in order to make some changes, to reach reintegration, the occupation, to showcase what's happening in the Crimean Peninsula. So the Crimean Peninsula would not disappear from the global agenda. And so the fact that we communicate with them, regardless of what was sent by Olga and Tatiana, regardless of the jamming of the broadcast, Ukraine broadcast, and so this is just, this is their understanding of the situation. This is the realization that they can suffer a lot because of their stance. But with some victims, we cannot communicate physically. Unless
To come in, I'll have Iskander give the last word. So please.
Katerina has said it well regarding communication, but we have been trying these 8 years to withstand the total militarization and a total destruction of identity. Ukraine initiated a very good program for children in the occupied territories. We started to build distant channels so the children who stay in the occupied territories could have access to Ukrainian education. But on the 24th of February 2022, the full-scale war has started, and now communication is very difficult. But it doesn't mean that we want to avoid doing anything. No, just let me quote you one of the first persons of the Russian Federation. I'm so sorry, but I will read it in the original language. It is necessary to re-educate the population. I'm so sorry. It's necessary to re-educate the population by censoring, repression, and suffocating the pro-Ukrainian position in culture, in education. We need to eradicate materials and ban all the Ukrainian programs. This is the quote from the first officials of the Russian Federation that are responsible for education. That's why when Dave asks us what kind of support we need the support of the parliaments of almost all countries of Europe in order to impose personal sanctions against people who are responsible for the crimes that they committed or still commit through educational facilities and many different educational channels. Thank you very much.
The last word, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. I would like to pay attention that in Crimea there is limited access to information, and we try to inform our compatriots through ATR Crimean Tatar TV channel, because a lot of our compatriots, they seek this TV channel both on YouTube and via satellite communication regarding the Europe and Western world. We actively cooperate and continue to cooperate, but we have limited access to other mass media to not inform them. We experience significant problems with Asian countries and Middle East because they have insufficient information from us. In 2017, we created an international movement for the occupation of Crimea and solidarity with the Crimean Tatars, liberate Crimea to activate and to activate diasporas of other countries, including Tatar and Ukraine, those who fight for democracy and justice. These are diasporas of Lithuania, Estonia, Chechnya, Uyghur, and using different efforts, companies' efforts, we inform the society of those countries. This is very important because the parliament of these countries, for them, it's very important to know how their electorate thinks. It's very important to work with the population of the countries, including the countries that are members of Crimean Platform, so the citizens in those countries could support the policy of Ukraine in the restating its statehood. Thank you.
Panelists, I think this kind of concludes our time together, and we're here, of course, for the Parliamentary Summit of the Crimea Platform, which begins tomorrow. And in this regard, we have recommendations, calls for members of Parliament, and ways that they can support the people of Crimea. Number one, back efforts which respect and reflect the agency of Ukrainian civil society. Ukrainian civil society is incredibly resilient and playing a critical role in addressing the human rights crisis stemming from Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Number two, strongly and collectively condemn the detention and conviction of political prisoners, including Nariman Jalal, Azan Akhmedov, Aziz Akhmedov, Irina Danilovich, Remzi Bekirov, Vilen Temiryanov, Vladislav Yesipenko, and all political prisoners. Number three, support victims of political reprisals in Crimea, their families, and their lawyers. Use your platforms to name them as often as you can. Raise their names in media interviews. Number four, use all available parliamentary mechanisms to continue to monitor and document human rights violations, war crimes, and crimes against humanity in occupied Crimea, and include them in regular reports on the human rights situation in Ukraine. And finally, ensure support to the Ukrainian authorities in investigating war crimes, crimes against humanity, and gross violations of human rights in the occupied Crimea. So with that, let me thank again our panelists for joining us today, and thank you to the organizers and to the other co-organizers of this event. Thank you for your time.